This is Guns Unpacked, a podcast where we interrogate, engage, and elevate the terms of the gun debate as we know it. I am your host, Jennifer Carlson, director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. Today, we are joined by a key conversation setter in the area of gun scholarship, Dr. Jonathan Metzl. Jonathan is the Frederick B. Rentschler II Professor of Sociology and Psychiatry and the Director of the Department of Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University. He is the award-winning author of 7 books, including Dying of Whiteness and What We've Become, Living and Dying in a Country of Arms. His work has mounted a broad array of crucial interventions. It has reframed the politics of mental illness as white backlash against Black power, interrogated the history of psychiatry, gender, and the rise of so-called wonder drugs, and finally, and most directly relevant to today's conversation, worked to mend our broken conversation about gun violence in America. He hails from Kansas City, Missouri, and splits his time between Brooklyn, New York, and Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I want to start by talking about your trajectory. What We've Become is not your first work on guns. It's not even your first book on guns. You've been engaging with guns for quite a while. But what I think is interesting about your academic or intellectual biography is that you didn't enter academia thinking of this as one of your core specialties. And so I was wondering if you could tell us how you found your way into this subfield, or perhaps better put, how it found you. And your 2011 Lancet piece, Should the Mentally Ill Bear Arms? That's your first academic piece that you wrote on guns. Is that right?
That is right. How it found me is an apt description. I had long been a scholar of race and gender in America, and also trained as a psychiatrist and a critical theorist. And I didn't think I was going to start focusing on guns centrally. I had done a lot of work on racism and mental illness and had written a book called The Protest Psychosis, which was about stereotypes of Black masculinity and how those are interpreted as violent by society. That book came out in 2010. And then a couple of months after the book came out and I'd started to do the rounds, the Trayvon Martin shooting happened, and I was bombarded with media requests because in the book I talked a little bit about guns and what it meant for a white open carry patriot to carry a gun versus what it meant for Malcolm X to take a picture with a machine gun. And that started one part of my kind of gun career, that I was doing just a lot of media interviews about stereotypes of race, what it meant to kind of be a protector versus to be a threat or a criminal, which was the divide that I wrote about. And then after mass shootings, because I'm a psychiatrist, I would get many calls from the media asking me if mental illness was the cause of mass shootings. And so after maybe 400 media requests, I started to think, maybe there is something here, because I kept trying to complicate. I would get asked these questions, which to me were well-intentioned, but complete oversimplifications of the dynamic that I saw happening. And so I just started to interrogate it, and one thing led to another. I wrote a bunch of articles about mental illness and mass shooting. I started co-directing a gun violence prevention organization in Tennessee. Then I did my research for Dying of Whiteness, which is in part a book about gun suicide, and then most recently the book about the Nashville mass shooting.
Yeah, and I want to talk about Dying of Whiteness, which came out in 2019, and its consideration of guns and suicide. So you go to Missouri and you interview gun owners as well as people impacted by gun suicide, and basically set up this puzzle as to how people can embrace guns even as guns cause harm. And so can you tell us how guns figure into your broader argument about whiteness in that book?
Well, the main argument of the book is how, with actually very little judgment, I'm not critiquing white supremacy or dismantling whiteness. I'm looking at how certain performances of what it means to be a conservative white American end up, on one hand, building tribal identity and political identity, and on the other hand, shorten lifespan. And so I look at people who, as part of their membership in the cult of republicanism, were told to reject the Affordable Care Act. I look at people who support budget cuts to their own kids' schools. But a key part of that was spending months and months living in not just Missouri, but southern Missouri. Very dominantly white area around Cape Girardeau, Missouri, which people have called for a long time gun country, and understandably so. And I start to ask people kind of what role guns play in their everyday lives. and also about when the really horrific and tragic effects of guns, gun suicide, accidental shootings start to really hit home in Missouri. Did that change people's minds about gun safety? And part of what that identity was to not question guns. And I don't say that critically. Guns were part of people's everyday lives. They were part of their religion almost. That's kind of how I came to understand it. And so it was a kind of particular identity, which being pro gun or pro gun rights was just an unquestionable part of the equation, and really started to ask people what the trade off was between that identity and protection and liberty, which were very important to people on one side, and the really unfortunate and horrible effects of the people I spoke to with lost children to accidental shootings or lost spouse to gun suicide. And so kind of how to balance that.
And What We've Become obviously squarely focuses on guns. So this is a book that just came out. We're recording in 2024. This is probably going to come out in 2025, but just came out. And it is all about the Waffle House mass shooting in Nashville, Tennessee. And in some ways, it seems obvious that you would write this book, given your connection to Nashville, your prior work. But I'm wondering what actually was like the tipping point that led you to write it. So was there a moment where you said, this is what I have to be doing now. This is what I'm meant to be doing right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually didn't think I was going to write another gun book. I felt like Dying of Whiteness was incredible research, but it was tiring, to be honest. I mean, not tiring like boredom, tiring like emotionally draining. And I thought, I've said my piece and I'm going to step back and think about it. And then in 2018, there was a horrible mass shooting in our town. And three things became pretty apparent right away as news started to spread. The first was that this was another mass shooting by a gunman with a Bushmaster AR-15, semi-automatic, so lots of bullets, lots of carnage. The second was that this shooting happened not in the downtown Lower Broadway cowboy hat and country music part of Nashville. It happened in an area a little bit outside of town that is predominantly working class and predominantly communities of color live there. And so it was very clearly immediately that a Waffle House in this area was going to have a lot of victims of color. And that was the case, that there were four young adults of color who died and many more were injured. And so it was also a story about race. And then the last piece of information came out that it was a shooter who was not only white, but also almost completely naked. He was wearing a green jacket and had this AR-15 and was pretty clearly psychotic. And so it was a story about race, about mental illness, about guns, about Nashville. And it felt to me like I was kind of increasingly felt like a story that I really had to unpack and tell.
I want to go ahead and I really want to dig into the argument of the book and so many just really incredible detail and insight that this book gives us. But before we do that, I do want to just lay out the argument for listeners so we can dig deeper into it. So this book uses the Waffle House mass shooting in order to tell a much bigger story, not just about gun violence, but about gun policy and gun politics. And you introduce this idea of the Dickey Line to explain the limits of gun policy. And that's both why we don't have effective gun policies, but also why the gun policies we do have aren't nearly as effective as we often think they are or should be or could be. And so can you explain this concept of the Dickey Line and how it fits into your overall argument?
Thank you so much. I've been so looking forward to this conversation because I wanted to talk about that point with you. And also, even though I've been talking about the book for 5 months now, this is actually the first time I've been asked about it, even though for me as a scholar, it was just for me really the most kind of mind-blowing part of the research, which is that I have assumed for my entire professional life studying firearms that there was a divide between people who lived on the public health side of the world, kind of people who lived in New York and California and Boston and Honolulu and other places that had democratic governance usually and some form of gun laws, and then people who lived in red state where not just the laws were blocked, but the knowledge was blocked. And so it created this red-blue divide, which liberals, I think, had for a long time misunderstood as being a divide between public health knowledge and ignorance, or between science and anti-science, or information and misinformation. Those are the biases or the binaries that we hear all the time. And what I started to see was that actually in communities and cities and towns that not only were red state and purple state that became red state areas, but also places where the little bit of research that was happening wasn't really making its way into those communities. There was an entirely different paradigm, way of understanding guns and safety and liberty that had nothing to do with the prevention framework that is framed around public health. In fact, public health and the idea of kind of communal participation was totally antithetical, but it made sense to people who were living in areas where there were a lot of guns, that guns were about neighborliness and, citizenship, to quote your great work, and community and safety, all these paradigms that the public health, I think people like me had fallen into a trap of saying, we just need to overturn this and do more research, which we did. I mean, certainly we did. But I think what we lost was that public health work is based on the prevention framework, and that is not the framework that is at play in a lot of the gun rights communities that I was interacting with. And so it created a false sense of kind of, if we just get more knowledge and more research, then everybody's going to play along with these public health rules. And what we didn't see was that really we were being divided around the politics of public health. That really set the tone for how I understood this divide and also my critique of public health.
Yeah, and I think what's really powerful about this is one of the points you make in the book is that, the irony of this is that even as public health research has been rebooted, there's much more funding, there's much more of an emphasis on, we can solve this with public health. It's not the case, at least as you show it in your book, it's not the case that these policies have kind of traveled from north of the Dickey Line to south of the Dickey Line, but rather the policies from south of the Dickey Line, which would be the non-public health way of understanding all of this, are flooding the north, even in spaces like Eleanor, where we would think this is where a public health perspective would really set the terms of gun policy. And so one of the key interventions that's been really popularized recently in terms of sort of public health interventions is red flag laws. And you tell this story of Jean. So Jean is one of the shooter's relatives. And I think this so persuasively just illuminates so many aspects of how these laws actually might work on the ground. And I think you mentioned that there was not a red flag law in place when this was all going on in Illinois. But I'd like you to just sort of tell us the story of Jean and how that made you sort of think differently about these public health interventions that are very much predicated on, somebody's going to see a warning sign, they're going to tell an authority, and then suddenly we will be able to really effectively prevent mass shootings like what happened in Waffle House.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, the assumption for red flag law, and let me just say that I completely support red flag laws, and I think we need more opportunities. And so before I jump into the critique, I just want to say that living in Tennessee and having worked in this area for a long time, the opportunities for families who see a loved one spiraling are pretty much zero if you live in a pro-gun state. That's because the police really don't have any rights whatsoever to do anything about it until somebody kills somebody or kills themselves. And so I'm very pro public health and I'm very pro red flag laws. But we've gotten into a situation, I think, where there's a mass shooting and then people like me get on television and say, of course it's common sense. We need common sense gun laws, common sense. And it's the opposite of common sense if people don't believe in our points. It's a misnomer a little bit because it makes sense if you believe in public health, you believe that there should be some kind of legal process that involves the police and judges and observation and regulation and mandating and government to regulate, to temporarily restrain firearms. But if you're coming from a totally different paradigm, which is the paradigm that actually owns firearms because of mistrust of the government, then the idea of a red flag law is completely antithetical. And so part of the story is about what it means to try to convince people that a red flag law is something people should be doing in a place where, as was the case in this mass shooter's, Travis Ranking's family, his parents were very pro-gun, very suspicious of the government, probably linked to QAnon. And so all the red flag law language in the world wasn't going to influence them. And ultimately, the character in this book, Gene, the cousin, ends up just buying guns for himself and his whole family because convincing people that they should mandate regulation and disarmament for their relatives is just a really hard sell. And I think that probably will convince, again, people who already are wary of guns, and I estimate about 15 to 20% of the people, but there are a lot of people who are just not willing to basically call the cops on their relatives or the judiciary on their relatives. And that includes not just white conservative gun owners, but also Black Americans, for example, who are pretty wary of the legal system also for different reasons. And so I'm not against red flag laws, but what I hope to show by these stories is that it's not the panacea that it's held out to be, and that it doesn't work if you don't address the broader context.
Yeah. There's a lot of people out there, millions of people are gun owners, and they have made a choice to embrace guns and bring guns into their everyday lives, but also like what's underlying that. And I think this point about anti-government sentiment is really, really powerful and not always fully taken into account in public health approaches to addressing gun violence. So I really appreciate that. I want to kind of shift a little bit to a choice that you, I think, had to make, even though it would be hard to imagine this book otherwise, but the choice to make the mass shooter really be the central character in the book. And in some ways, he's your foil. So you're kind of standing in for the public health scholar who's devised all these perfectly tweaked interventions that sound great on paper, but ultimately don't end up being nearly as effective as they should be. And obviously, you name the shooter. And again, I imagine you've thought about this, especially given the calls to not name mass shooters in particularly high-profile cases. And so I just want to hear if you can explain why it is important not just to name the shooter, but to have him as the most central character, I would argue, besides you in the book.
The core question of the book is, what does it take to disarm a white man? And particularly, what does it take to disarm a white man who is telling everybody that he's about to commit a mass shooting and is stopped by the police 5 times, is stopped by the FBI when he tries to barge into the White House grounds. And so this is a story about the armed white body. And the end of the book kind of shows how, the narrative of the book really shows that in many parts of the country, the white body, even a psychotic white body, even a body that is intent on harm, is really the sign and the symbol of gun rights, that in a way gun rights supersede preventative disarmament. And so I just, first of all, couldn't tell that story without telling the story of the shooter. It's the story that falls out. Now, I understand why people don't name mass shooters. I think particularly in the early days of the kind of mass shooting era, there was a ton of copycat, and people were using this mass shooters were just clearly in conversation with each other. It takes a lot to get attention and on the news. I'm skeptical that not naming the mass shooters has arrested that in a way. I mean, we have many more mass shootings now than we did 10 years ago, but also, again, everybody has the right to make their own mind about this, and I respect many different opinions. But for me, not saying the name of the mass shooter would make it harder for me to tell a story about the history of the mass shooter and the race of the mass shooter and the ideology of the mass shooter and the ways in which society repeatedly, again and again, saw an armed white man, even a psychotic armed white man in the part of the country that he came from, as someone whose rights were to be defended. And that was also the case after the mass shooting, where it's really about open carry, and we expanded dramatically open carry rights after the shooting happened. And so I couldn't possibly tell that story if I didn't get into his story. But it's not just his story, it's also the story of the guns. And so what I do is I track not just the shooter, his body, his ideology, I also track the guns, because how the guns got to be at a Waffle House at 2 a.m. On a Sunday morning in April in 2018 is another part of that story, which is linked to the whiteness of the shooter. And so I just think that for me, telling the story, and part of what I'm also trying to write against is mass shootings habituated now. They happen so quickly, even the most horrible ones. I mean, as you and I speak, a couple of weeks ago, there was a shooting by a 13-year-old at a school. We're like soldiers now. We have PTSD. We habituate this violence, and then we move on to the next thing because it's just too much. And you shouldn't have to do that in peacetime, but that's kind of where we're at. And so I did try to tell the story of just one shooting, just to slow down the clock and say, look what we're missing if we don't look in detail at the shooting, which is in part about the incredible bravery and resilience of the victims and their families, but also a story about just about guns that is not captured, I don't think, by the cycle that we're in, where there's a mass shooting and then we call for background checks and red flag laws, and then we kind of rinse and repeat.
So I hope we have time to come back to this, the way that you stop the clock in this book. But I want to follow up first on just talking a little more deeply about how whiteness shapes gun access leading up to this mass shooting. So the moments that you describe where the shooter almost has his gun seized, where there's almost this punitive response to his, troubling and threatening actions, and then the police and his parents basically opt to rout him out of the criminal justice system. And I think this just spoke such volumes, I mean, obviously about the racial politics of policing in this country, and also how calls to, for example, decarcerate, to, bring trauma-informed policing into play, to think of alternatives to policing in the criminal justice system, how those actually play out on the ground and to whose benefit. And so to me, this was also really a moment to highlight just how dependent public health approaches are on the criminal justice system and specifically the police to actually get them off the ground. And so I'm curious, thinking about public health scholars and what they should take from this reality that you unearthed, how would you like public health scholars to read your book and rethink how they engage, how they think about enforcement and the need to interrogate both the politics of whiteness and the reliance on the criminal justice system for gun policy?
Yeah, what a good question. Well, I'll answer a question and then I'll ask you a question if you don't mind in return, which is you and I have both spent a lot of time talking to gun owners in a kind of sociological framework, kind of more ethnographic framework. One of the things I've learned in talking to a lot of gun owners is, it's interesting, right? The public health model is great in many ways. The public health model, there's a man-made pathogen, and what we do is we first create a data set, do a lot of research that shows that that pathogen is killing people, and then we devise policies that might alleviate or reduce some of the injury and death. And once we have that knowledge base and those policies, then we work with governments in order to implement those policies. And then we bring kind of financial backers, the industry, to its knees by the threat of class action suit. And so that framework was really effective, for example, with tobacco and cigarettes, that we proved to the world that secondhand smoke is really dangerous in addition to smoking. We then developed policies, we sued the tobacco companies, and that really changed common knowledge across the country. If you light up a cigarette really anywhere in the country in a restaurant, everybody will tell you to get out of the restaurant. And the same thing with seatbelts, for example. I mean, if you watch movies from the 50s, you just want to cringe because people are driving around with their kids bopping around in the car and nobody's wearing a seatbelt. And seatbelts really became part of our common knowledge in a way that if you don't wear a seatbelt, something bad could happen to you. And pretty much anywhere in the country, if somebody gets in your car and they don't click it, then you're going to say hey, bud, we're not driving until you put that on. So that was a really effective approach. Asbestos, you can think of a lot of different ways, but it really wasn't an effective approach to guns. Not that we didn't have the knowledge base, but I think there were two main things that I talk about in the book that I really think we missed. And number one is if you talk to a lot of gun owners, they don't see guns as health risks. It's not like they see them like secondhand smoke or riding in a car without a seatbelt. The rhetoric of prevention just did not pervade what we might loosely call gun culture. People see guns as protection, as protectors, as liberty. In a way, guns are their version of public health. And so a kind of public health rhetoric of everybody play by the same rules and we're going to create herd immunity and stuff like that. It didn't penetrate the gun world, partially because of what I call the Dickey divide in the book, but for a bunch of other reasons too, having to do with the meaning of guns, the role of guns, the historical meaning of gun ownership, advertising by the gun industry, things like that. And so just coming in like a bunch of East Coast public health people and saying, you guys, it's common sense for you to follow our rules. As much as I personally believe in those rules, it just didn't work. And so partially I'm trying to challenge the public health world to just ask the question of like, why didn't it work? Why didn't we have the same success with guns? And it turns out that we were facing an entirely different adversary that had a much more developed theory of power, and it knew how to seed local governments and seat judges, that public health data just wasn't the be-all end-all the way it was in other places. And the other part, of course, is that the gun manufacturers are largely free from the kind of class action suits that have driven other industries to change. And so I'm really asking a question, which is, let's recognize our successes, but also kind of how we got here, which is a divided country, maybe inevitably, and after Bruin, threats to many gun laws across the country. And so that we can, instead of continually doing the same thing over and over, start to think about what we might do different.
Yeah. There's a lot there. And I kind of actually want to jump to a question that I thought I'd kind of have as a wrap-up question, but I feel like it's actually really pertinent to what you said just now, which is, what does this space look like then that we want to create beyond the public health narrative or beyond the Dickey line? And one of the articles that I kept coming back to when I was reading your book was this classic article that, I'm sure you know inside and out, More Statistics, Less Persuasion, which is a 2003 law review article by social psychologist Dan Kahn and Donald Brahman. And basically they argue that, look, like statistics, and I would say we can just put in like any kind of this is what the science says kind of reasoning, that statistics won't solve the gun debate because it's not our rational minds as much as our cultural frameworks that divide us in terms of how we make sense of guns as tools of self-defense versus instruments of violence. And so culture matters. And so culture is where we have to actually engage the gun debate. Okay, so this is my question then, is that, and every time I teach this article with my students, I'm like, so what do you actually think they mean by this concept? They use this term pluralistic expressive idiom, which I'm like, okay, we were getting somewhere, but now we've just lost everybody. So as far as I can tell, this means creating space for respectful, tolerant, but still evidence-oriented conversation within the gun debate or gun politics. And it's a space that's capable of recognizing or taking into account everyone's different cultural orientations around guns as valid. So part of this question is like, is that where you're going with this book? Is that what you're hoping to forge? Is that even possible? Because I have to say, one of the frustrations, and it was a good frustration in reading your book, is that I was never really sure if this was a deeply pessimistic take or actually had this sort of silver lining optimism. And I felt at different places, I felt very different in terms of sort of the sense of hope that this book gives. So I'm curious, if you could speak to that.
And let me ask, where did you end up with that?
Where did I end up? I think I'm still very ambivalent. And part of that is related to another question that I want to ask you about how you actually are thinking about the culture wars.
Well,
I guess I could also ask that question.
No, that's fine. I mean, for me, like I did find it personally, I mean, this was by far the hardest book I've ever written, just personally, for people who get to read the book. The chapter on the mass shooting where I go into the room, it was by far the most intense thing I've ever done. I had to actually go and just rent an Airbnb for 3 weeks and be by myself and just sit with it. It was so painful. It was a hard book to write. And I think that probably comes through in a lot of places because these are real people and real lives lost and real families trying to rebuild afterwards. But increasingly, I mean, the book is partially about my learning a lot of the points we're talking about today. I didn't start off thinking I was going to be, I guess, critical of public health, or rethinking public health is one way to put it. But I do think that there's kind of an uncertainty, which is we just keep creating greater and greater data sets about how the prevention framework saves lives. But as that has been happening, we're losing, I think, in many places in the country, the cultural and political debates. And so I guess for me, there was something, I would say, liberating in a way of just thinking about how we got here, which was not just science versus ignorance or resistance. It was also two totally different paradigms. And so for me, part of the process of the book is partially a process of understanding like why what I'm doing is not working and trying to think about why that was. And so for me, that led me to a bunch of different solutions. So by the end of the book, I advocate for a bunch of different structural effects that are not about, I'm a liberal and I believe in common sense gun laws, and I think we should regulate every product that's dangerous to people. And I believe in more government, not less. I'm pretty open about that. But I also found it liberating to think about what the gun debate might look like if we also imagined that regulation was not our main point, which makes me nervous because we're talking now before the election and the Democratic platform is pretty much all based in government and regulation. I understand like we have a lot of people who support that, and so hopefully that is helpful. But I try to say, let's imagine if you couldn't do public health or regulation, what will you do? And so I end up supporting kind of a 10-point agenda that has to do with civic space and civic engagement and rebuilding a sense of safety in public, a kind of anti-open carry agenda that's based in civic investment and not based entirely in regulation. And so it led me to some very, very, very different places than where I thought. And I actually did personally find that to be, I don't think optimistic is a word I would use about this book, but I did find it to be, it just changed my perspective in a way that really changed my understanding of what it is that I do. It's a really sad, hard book in a lot of places, but hopefully people see that it leads us to maybe some different avenues that might help explain why we're so stuck.
Yeah, it reminds me of, those headlines that often come after a particularly egregious mass shooting because we know that they happen now way more than the, news headlines capture them. And, it's the op-ed that's headlined, the gun debate is over. The gun debate is over. And I think you're right. It's not a moment for optimism, but it is a moment for liberation from sort of the confines of a debate that really has not been productive. I think we can say that like the way the terms are structured, I would say even for maybe across the debate, it has not been moving us forward in a variety of ways. So that does lead me to my question about culture wars. And I feel like what you do in this book that's really great is you actually allow the reader to experience the process of processing this in the book, and not just in terms of like the egregiousness of this shooting and the horror that survivors faced, but also you questioning your own politics and your own allegiances in terms of what needs to be done. And so, thinking about the culture wars, I love the way you kind of use the Dickey Line as a proxy for talking about the culture wars. And in some ways, much like Dine of Whiteness, you show very much how our partisan politics have become self-destructive. And then there's other places where it does seem like you're kind of trying to repackage the public health side of the culture war to make it more effective or more compelling. And so I guess, and I'm not sure if I'm just asking you the same question, so maybe something different will come up in your mind when I ask this, but, thinking about where you stand in the culture war, I think there's the argument that we need to transcend this and just move beyond. There's the argument that we need to bridge it. And so I think this is where like the liberal gun owners become really interesting, not just because they're liberals who own guns, but because they're often people who are open to different kinds of government intervention in aspects of gun policy, even as they are very much embracive of gun rights. Or are you just laying this out so the two sides can, or one side, I guess, the public health side can fight more strategically? So yeah, I guess like where ultimately do you stand vis-a-vis this culture war?
Well,
Or are you just a conscientious objector?
no, 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 no. Like you, I'm in many spaces. I grew up in Missouri. I lived in Michigan. I now live in Tennessee. I love Brooklyn, but I've lived in many parts of the country with many friends who are on many sides of this issue. And so I guess just innately, I do not adhere to the kind of pathologizing the other side that is really the currency of social media and everything else that we stereotype and then dismantle people we disagree with. I'm not like that. So it is deep for me on a personal level. But I guess I can be honest about the process of this book, which is it was a really hard book to get published, to be honest. I thought like, man, I'm rethinking the gun debate here and in ways that people should think about. And there was just an ungodly amount of resistance. The first title I had for the book was How We Lost, which apparently nobody was very interested in, but I was talking about how we lost the gun debate and nobody wanted to hear about it, even though my book before this, I'll say humbly, did incredibly well. But part of the story here was people didn't think there was space to quote unquote critique our own side. And I have a million shocking stories about that I'll reveal maybe one day about
Can
about
you reveal any? Just one?
yeah, I got rejected by 40 publishers, this book. And people didn't think there was a space. They're like, oh, yeah, we did gun books already. And I'm like, look, this is a different kind of gun book. But people are embedded in this. And gun violence prevention groups that I'm a member of heard that I was being critical. They did not support the book in a way. And I'm like, look, there has to be a room for a critical debate right now. But it's such a zero-sum political system. And so we're kind of all on our side of our talking points. And so people really conveyed to me that this book wasn't going to get out if I didn't act like a doctor and prescribe the problem and offer medical solutions and all this kind of stuff. And so I did try to toe that line, but I think you're right to pick up that I am fighting it in the book in a way, because again, I am a doctor. I want there to be less pain. And I also really question whether doctors are the right authority figures for this issue, right? That if public health framework is not the paradigm that is going to lead us out of this, then I shouldn't be myself the expert, right? Which I'm not trying to get myself fired or anything, but I really struggle with that question. My hope is that this is a book that kind of sinks in over time. That's what I hope happens. One thing that happened to me while I was writing the book, we did an art exhibit in Nashville at a local gallery about guns and art. And it was a great event, really community event. Many different artists gave their art and it was just really, really cool. And I would say 98% of the art was people like me, kind of liberals who did like paintings of gun trauma or gun violence or can't we regulate guns or common sense. But there were two, they called themselves pro-gun artists who were doing really beautiful images of their semi-automatic rifles. And at the opening to the show, I was standing next to one of the artists who had put this piece and he said, do you think my piece is beautiful? And I said, yeah, it's actually like really beautiful. And he said, can you feel the power of how I feel about an AR-15? And I said, yeah, it actually comes through. Like it really is such a respectful, almost homage to your gun. And he said, does it make you want to carry an AR-15? And I kind of laughed and I said, not exactly. And he said, well, what kind of art would cause you to carry an AR-15? And I said, well, to be honest, I don't think there's any art that would have me carrying a, AR-15 around town. And he said, well, how do you think I feel every time somebody's making these moral claims about common sense to me, as if I'm going to change this belief that is in this thing and basically go over to the other side. And for me, it was just a powerful moment of recognizing that that's like such a powerful other side. And we just try to data people to death. And I mean, mass shootings are horrible. They're horrible. And we need more gun laws. So I'm even trying to balance it in this conversation. But I would say that this idea of kind of using mass shootings to then create these frameworks of common sense just was something that a lot of gun owners, including this artist, just felt like really defensive about in a particular way. And so I just started thinking, what would it mean to write a book that took that perspective, if not into account, at least tried to understand that there are perspectives beyond public health? And, since the book came out, it has been accepted by many pro-gun publications, but it's been a hard process to have this conversation with who I'll call my own side.
Yeah. I'm really surprised to hear about the gun violence prevention groups that were like, we don't know. We don't know whether we want to engage this. Would you say that was the most surprising response to the book so far? Or has there been other stuff that's been really surprising to you?
No, I mean, I think it was it was challenging as heck for me. It took about 6 months for this to sink in for a lot of people. And I think now, I'm having conversations like the one we're having now. I'm doing a lot more media now than when the book first came out. I'll be speaking at the meeting in Seattle in December and other things. And so engaging people. But again, I just want to acknowledge that the stakes of that are very high when winning or losing an election can depend on that. Also, your own positionality about gun violence. It's easier for me to say this and not somebody who's living in South Chicago who's surrounded by gun violence 24/7. I'm very mindful of why it's not just like I'm right and they're wrong. I understand this as a dynamic, but I do want people to think like how we got here and to think really hard about what it would take to get out of this. It's not just trying to convince people that we're right, because part of what we are doing as liberal gun scholars is advocating for government mandates that would impact a lot of people who don't share our views.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there could be a whole other, I guess it would be an autoethnography among gun scholars of like, okay, the process of getting this work out. And, especially sociologists or sociology minded scholars who are pushing against dominant narratives, they get the work out and then the reception. And not just the initial reception, like you said, it's like, you're about 6 months or so out, or 8 months or 9 months. But, then like 5 years from now, people are going to reread the book and get something else out of it. And, in some ways, it's a really interesting way to see how not just how the debate has changed, but kind of going back to what you were saying before about like who are the experts and what are we expecting these experts to give us in this debate. And I think that kind of goes back to this. A lot of this is driven by we want somebody to just tell us what it is and solve it, right? And a lot of this involves, really deeply re-engaging like basic civic practices that we are, frankly, in this country just really, really out of, we're just not well versed and well practiced in anymore. So anyway, there's a lot to say, but I do want to actually get into something that I just thought was a really, just in terms of the writing and the way that you constructed the narrative, it was a really incredible way that you put together this book. And it's the way that you talk about time. And so, of course, you devote this wrenching chapter to the mere seconds that it took for the Waffle House shooting to take place. And this, I think, is one of the most powerful moments of the book because it's literally happening after you go through years and years and years of tracing the shooter's guns, everything leading to this burst of shooting in the Waffle House. And so you write about time, you write about the idea of killing time. And I thought this was so interesting because, a lot of people, academics, journalists, we've talked about and thought about how guns change space. So whether it's public space, private space, a movie theater, a concert hall, a Waffle House, it's different once guns are there as everyday objects. But we talk less about how time changes. And so I just wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit more about how guns transform the experience of time and thinking about time in all the different ways that you talk about it, both for the survivors, but also for people in the U.S. at large.
Well, I hope if people get a chance to read the book that they read the 42 seconds chapter, because what I show is in the time of mass shootings that time is happening on one hand faster than human comprehension, the speed of the bullets, the cavitating effects that bullets have on bodies, and conversely, the slowness of the effects that this will have as the death and trauma ripple out to really forever change families and communities and futures and possibilities. And so part of that is the direct effect of the mass shooting, and then part of that is the afterlife of the mass shooting, where people don't feel safe going into a public space anymore or look over their shoulder every time there's a loud noise, or stand toward the door or the exits, or all these kind of things that really change perceptions for better or worse. And it's not just mass shootings. I mean, I argue that kind of guns in public space really change the potential. I mean, you've got freedom, liberty, death, power, privilege, whiteness, masculinity, all kind of embodied in this thing that then people are kind of gravitating around. And on one hand, it is a sign of kind of destructive power. I mean, I remember at the height of the pandemic, when people who were kind of anti-public health would go around without masks and cough around people, and everybody was terrified because it's like, you're going to kill me with COVID. But this kind of anti-public health stance brought a lot of power. It kind of changed the power dynamic of rooms or airplanes where I was. And I started thinking like guns kind of do the same thing in a certain kind of way. All of a sudden, the potential for death or defense or whatever really does impact the space. And I'm in Tennessee, and there are guns in a lot of spaces that are potentially being changed. I mean, I live downtown Tennessee, downtown Nashville. You can carry a gun into a bar, a loaded gun. How does having armed people in a bar change how people interact in that bar, how people drink in that bar, how people use pickup lines in that bar? All these kind of factors that we don't really capture with public health data. We can have guns in parks, guns in schools, etc. And so I just started thinking about guns and civic space, and there's so many examples of the destructive potential of that. In just yesterday, as we record this, there was a stand your ground shooting, and the person killed the attacker and 3 or 4 innocent bystanders. And last week, the police in New York shot somebody who was fare evader and shot 3 people who had nothing to do with it. And so in a way, this kind of anything could happen at any moment, and we're on guard for that. That's safety for some people, and it's just honestly terror. And so that's kind of where I'm going with the book, is that that's the regime we're creating by open carry and permitless carry and concealed carry, all the carries whose effects are not captured by injury and death data, which is the trade of public health. And I really think that's where we need to be going, is about thinking about that civic space, because that's kind of, I mean, we have 55,000 gun deaths a year in this country. It's 55,000 too many, but we have like 200 something million gun owners, over 400 million guns. And so the effect on civic space is much broader. And that meaning is shaped really by one side, by the NRA, which has been saying, here's what it means to own guns. And I argue we need to take that back.
So speaking of the militarization of everyday life, I heard that you were now studying Israeli gun culture. And if that's the case, can you give us a sneak peek at that research?
Well, I've published 2 pieces on it already. I don't know where it's going to go, but it's really Israel as a country. I've worked with Physicians for Human Rights, Israel, Palestine for decades now. And Israel was, in a way, the model of public health, for better or worse. For guns, a lot of people kind of held up the Israeli example of a country that had a lot of guns, but a particular narrative around guns. And really what I tell the story of is the Netanyahu Ben Gvir government and how they use the NRA argument to arm their supporters, have people lose faith in public health. So guns form a very, very, very anti-democratic, autocratic kind of dynamic. And so I'm happy to send around those pieces. I've got a couple of pieces written, and I'm thinking about kind of where to go with it. But I just think the anti-democratic function of guns is something that is being replicated in Israel, clearly, but also Brazil, Australia, many other places.
Yeah, we'd love to link that work in the bio. So definitely send that over. All right, final question. We have almost run out of time. What are you reading now? We're all going to read your book, but what are you reading now?
I'm still lecturing about the book, and so when I'm giving a lot of book talks, I gratuitously enjoy airport action thriller fiction. So I'm like rereading like Jack Reacher novels. Like I read Guns A-Blazing Garbage when I I love that stuff. But yeah, so when I'm talking about stuff, I'm teaching a class, I'm reading a lot of theory and stuff like that, but I'm in airports a lot these days, and I'm shamelessly reading kind of Clive Cussler and Lee Child and all those guys. So maybe not the answer you're expecting, but an honest one.
Dr. Jonathan Metzl of Vanderbilt University, author of What We've Become. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast.
Really my honor. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This has been Guns Unpacked, and I've been your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our center and all we do at csgs.asu.edu. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Regina Ravazova.